Hello, guys. Welcome back to our final lesson of ELA for the week. Yesterday, we listened to our last chapter in the book Harriet Tubman. So we're done with the book Harriet Tubman. We're still going to do some more lessons with it. But as far as actually listening to the story, we've listened to all of it. So I hope that you guys enjoyed it and that you learned a lot from this book because there was lots and lots of important information in it. So today we're going to be reading a timeline article and using the article to help us answer questions about abolitionists and slavery. So we know that Harriet and many other people fought for years and years to bring slaves to freedom. We know that they worked very hard to try to end slavery in America. So people who fought to help end slavery were called abolitionists. So the definition of an abolitionist is a person who supports and fights for the end of slavery. So throughout our Harriet Tubman unit, we've learned and read about many different abolitionists. So I'd like to just briefly review some of the most important abolitionists and their history that we learned about in our unit. So the first abolitionist that we learned about was Harriet Tubman herself. And we know that Harriet escaped slavery and then devoted her life to helping runaway slaves and fighting to end slavery. So Harriet Tubman is a perfect example of an abolitionist. We also read about Frederick Douglass, and Frederick escaped slavery just like Harriet, and he spent his life fighting to end slavery. He did this by writing books, giving speeches, and trying to change the laws for Black men and women. Remember that he wanted Black people to have the right to vote. We learned about the Underground Railroad and all the people who were a part of the Underground Railroad. Now remember that the Underground Railroad, it wasn't a real train station or trains. It was actually a secret network of tunnels, routes, and houses that were used to help runaway slaves escape to freedom in the North. Remember that the abolitionists who helped the runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, they were called conductors. Just like how a real train has a conductor to drive it, the abolitionists were called the conductors of the Underground Railroad, and they all hated slavery. All right, number 4, we learned about William Still. And William was a Black man, but he was not a slave. He was born a free man. But he spent his life helping to free runaway slaves. And he's known as the father of the Underground Railroad because he was a very active member and conductor on the Underground Railroad. And through this, he helped to free over 800 slaves. So he freed a lot of slaves in his lifetime. We also read about a man named Thomas Garrett. And Thomas was an abolitionist who, if you remember, he helped Harriet when she rescued her parents. Remember, he was the one that paid for the train tickets for Harriet's parents to escape north. And one important abolitionist that we learned about was John Brown. And remember, John Brown was the one who planned the attack on the U.S. arsenal. And his plan was to raid the arsenal, take all the weapons, and give them out to runaway slaves so that they could rise up and fight against their masters. But remember that the slaves, they never showed up to come get the weapons. So John Brown ended up getting arrested and he was hung. So Harriet had said he was a better man for the slaves than Abraham Lincoln because John Brown gave up his life fighting for the freedom of slaves. So it says Brown lost his life fighting for the freedom of slaves. Okay, so we know that abolitionists wanted to end slavery in America, and they helped slaves to escape. They spoke out against slavery in books, newspapers, and they gave speeches. So today we're going to read a timeline article to learn some more about some of these abolitionists. So before we do that, I just want to review the definition of a timeline. And you guys are all familiar with timelines because we've worked with them in class. So remember that a timeline is a list of important events, and it's arranged in the order in which they happen. So we call this chronological order. So a lot of the times the timeline will have years or dates, and they all start from the first event to the last event. So they take place in the order in which they happened. Some examples of timelines that we've worked with in class. Remember, you guys made timelines of your own life, starting from when you were a baby to your age now, to a teenager or preteen. So remember, we made a timeline about that. We also made timelines on the human life cycle from an infant to an elderly person. And another example of a good timeline would be a timeline about the Civil War. So it would start in 1861, and the end of the timeline would be 1865 when the Civil War ended. And in between, you could put different important events that happened during the Civil War. Okay, so now we're going to read the timeline. And as I read this article, you're going to be looking for these to be able to answer these questions. So after reading, you should be able to answer the following questions. Who were the abolitionists? When did they speak out against slavery? And when did slavery finally end? So after we read the timeline, you will know who the abolitionists were, when they spoke out against slavery, and when slavery ended. All right, so now I'm going to go to the timeline. You guys can follow along while I read it out loud. So I'm going to start with the introduction at the bottom. It says, fighting against slavery. Between 1830 and 1870, many people wanted to stop slavery. These people were called abolitionists. Some abolitionists helped slaves to escape. Other abolitionists spoke out against slavery in books and newspapers. Okay, so now let's take a look at the start of our timeline. We have a picture right here, and our first date is 1826. And if you notice the dates, we have 1826, 1831, 1852, and 1865. So you'll notice that these are in the order in which they happened. So the earliest date to the latest date. Okay, 1826. This woman is Sojourner Truth. She was born a slave in 1797. In 1826, she escapes from slavery and becomes an abolitionist. She gives speeches and writes a book against slavery. So that's why they have the date 1826, because that was the date when she became an abolitionist. And she fought against slavery by giving speeches and writing a book. She wrote a very famous book, Sojourner Truth. All right, 1831. William Lloyd Garrison. So this is William Lloyd Garrison. 1831. William Lloyd Garrison and a friend start a newspaper called The Liberator. Here's the newspaper right here, The Liberator. The word liberate means to free someone. Garrison is an abolitionist who writes stories against slavery and slave owners. Okay, so in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison started this newspaper, The Liberator, which spoke out against slavery. And they wrote stories against slavery and against the cruel slave owners. Now we go to 1852. And you have a book here. It's a famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. 1852. Harriet Beecher Stowe finishes her book about slaves called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book is very popular. Many people say that Uncle Tom's Cabin helped to start the Civil War. So this was a very important book that helped to change a lot of people's minds about slavery, and they feel that it was one of the reasons why the Civil War got started. Then we go all the way from 1852 to 1865, and we look at this picture here. It says in 1865, the United States passes a new law called the 13th Amendment. The law says that slavery is illegal. So slavery is now illegal. That means not allowed. All slaves are free. In this picture, abolitionists cheer. So this is a drawing of a whole bunch of abolitionists celebrating. They're cheering because a new law has just been passed that outlaws slavery. It says slavery is now illegal in the United States. And that was the 13th Amendment, which is a very important law in our Constitution. Okay, so now you guys are going to go back, reread the timeline on your own, and then you'll use the timeline to help you answer the attached Google form questions. All right, good job. You can go get to work. Remember to take your time and really use the timeline to help you answer each question. All right, good job.